thank you very much for joining us this morning on this webinar, which is developed by Embellie Advisory in partnership with the Emerging Markets Investors Alliance. So thank you, Andrew, for being here. We are going to be tackling an issue which is very important today, especially as part of the attempts to secure social license to operate and sustainability, sustainable value creation for communities and companies on different projects, which is the interaction with First Nation and Indigenous communities. And I'm very happy to be surrounded by a set of experts that will talk about this issue with us today. As I said, this webinar is part of a larger series. We talked about community consent late last year with Columbia University and Insuko. Then we continued on issues of transparency of supply chains. Last month, we'll have a series of events on local content and on social partnership and social value creation for communities in the coming weeks and months. And on this one, again, Andrew is joining me as my alter ego. Andrew, thank you for being here. I mean, maybe Andrew, if you want to introduce a little bit the Alliance and our panelists for this morning, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll do that. And it's great to be back with you, Remi, and have another, what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion about social issues in the extractive industries. Something we look at a lot at the Emerging Market Investors Alliance. And for those of you who don't know, we're an NGO that connects investors with companies and governments, as well as policy experts, to look at a range of sustainability issues across different sectors, but extractive industry is a very important one for us and for developing countries, which is what our focus is. And so happy to be back with Remi to look at this very important issue about Indigenous connections and relations and best practice in that area. Have four very impressive panelists here, which Remi has brought together. So I'll just introduce very briefly. I won't say much, and I'll let you to kind of elucidate more, each of you. But first, we have Karen Ogen of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, also CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance. So really looking forward to your perspective, Karen, on engagement with the extractive companies and the issues that you have there. We have Harrie Vredenburg of the University of Calgary, great expert on community work, community reconciliation in this sector. Heather Lawrence joins us from the corporate side of Teck Resources Limited, and she is corporate manager of Indigenous Affairs for Teck Resources, of course, the large Canadian mining company. And finally, Fiorella Madariaga, who, like Remi, is with Embellie Advisory. So really a great panel. And yeah, Remi, I think you get the honor of asking the first question.
Yes, I do. And this webinar is going to be obviously talking a lot about issues in British Columbia, in Canada in general. And Fiorella is bringing in the perspective from Latin America. At Embellie Advisory, we'll also work in Africa. I know there's a series of different participants and attendees from Africa and as far as Papua New Guinea. I've seen this. So we're going to try to provide a larger context on these issues of relation with First Nation Indigenous communities, and try to see, on the different perspective, how to align them and to work together. Also wanted to mention the fact that, Embellie Advisory works with the Devonshire Initiative, setting up a series of short courses for, companies and NGOs as a Chatham House forum for discussion on those issues. And so we will develop and continue working on those, especially with Fiorella. Maybe the first question, and I mean, we're very lucky to have Karen with us, with a long history in Wet'suwet'en First Nation and in British Columbia with the LNG Alliance. Karen, can you maybe just tell us, your perspective, obviously from your experience, and how you see, especially from last, current events, the situation in terms of interaction between corporate actors and First Nations, and the capacity to work together, set agreements towards sustainable value creation and inclusive for both sides.
All right, thank you, Remi, and thank you for everyone. Welcome to everyone else, and thank you for having me on this webinar. First off, I'd like to sort of just give a bit of context. I've sat on council from 2010 to 2016 as the chief, and we put together a good negotiating team and to work with industry. And so we were able to sign off agreements, and to this day I still work with government and industry in relation to the current LNG pipeline. So what I've taken away from this whole experience and best practices in relation to Indigenous people is the first key and the first step is relationship building. I can't emphasize that enough. From beginning to end, even beyond, is optimum for best results. Any commitments made must be honored. Trust is the foundation for the relationship, and to make every attempt to keep the same team in place. I think that is really important, because we had the sort of the negotiating team, and then it switched off to a construction team and different players. So trust is a major factor, just because of historical practices in the past. And the partnerships between Indigenous communities and extractive companies. First, one of the things that is really important is that to know the history of the peoples of Canada. The second is, do not come in with an already made plan and expect the First Nations to buy into it. Don't come with a contract and agreement in hand and saying, well, nice to know you, nice to meet you, here you go, sign this. That's not the best approach. I think that it needs to be negotiated with the First Nations. There's no cookie cutter approaches here. The third is the meaning of accommodation. This piece is critical and crucial. Consultation and accommodation come hand in hand. The other piece is to have a good understanding about the UN declaration in Canada and in the provinces. That is underway as we speak. It's slow in coming, but it's on its way. It really sets the stage for rights and title in relation to Indigenous people in Canada. And lastly, or there's a couple more points I have. Procurement opportunities is very, very critical as well. I think that there's a lot of Indigenous people that have their economic development business arms in place that are ready to go. You know, we have the joint venture partnerships that, you know, bring meaningful benefits back to the community. That is critical. Like, that is part and parcel of the whole engagement process, is making sure that you don't just sign agreement and then that's it. They're forgotten about. You know, we want to be able to prosper and provide economic benefits back to the community. So I think that procurement piece is very critical to the nations that you're working with. Employment and training. We want to move the Indigenous people from poverty to prosperity. We want to improve the quality of life for the Indigenous people. How we do that is by building the capacity within the communities for its members and its citizens. We must make every attempt, every means possible to close those gaps of inequities. And finally, with that is the environment. The project must have the highest environmental standards possible. From an Indigenous perspective, we view ourselves as the caretakers of the land and the environment. We must find innovative and creative ways to ensure our waterways, the wildlife, hunting, fishing, and gathering of food is protected. I can't emphasize all these points well enough throughout the life of the project. I hope that answers your question, Remi.
It does perfectly, yes. And maybe before I pass over to Andrew, I just wanted to mention that we obviously welcome any questions from the audience, and we're here to interact as much as possible. We very much value different perspective and visions here, and we're here to try to set up the stage and suggest best practices. And Andrew, maybe that'd be interesting for you to take over.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Karen. You raised a lot of really interesting points, and I'd like to turn to Harrie now and maybe get Harrie for your response. To this, I'd say, extremely helpful framework, kind of almost like a shopping list of how investors should think about how to, prioritize the engagement in the best way and get it off on the right foot. What's your response to that? And particularly from kind of a project reconciliation perspective, how do we think about some of these points that Karen mentioned?
Well, thank you, Andrew and Remi, and Karen, thank you for that excellent introduction. And of course, Karen and I know each other, and we've been on programs or panels together in Calgary and in London, England as well. So I'm familiar, obviously, as well with what she's doing in British Columbia and Western Canada. And first of all, I'd like to, by way of introduction, also say, whereas Karen is Indigenous. I'm not. I've been working with Indigenous people for much of my adult life. I'm actually born in the Netherlands in Europe, and most of my adult life in Canada. And I've also spent a lot of time in Latin America, and my interest in issues around, I'm a business school professor. I also hold an appointment at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, and at Oxford. I have an international research fellow appointment as well. But my interest is on resource industries and environment and social aspects. And so I've been involved with issues around those in Canada, in Western Canada particularly, and in Latin America. I also spent a lot of time particularly in Ecuador, and did case studies and did a number of projects there. And then I did some fair bit of work in Mexico through the United Nations Development Program, working with Pemex. So my exposure is not just Canada, it's Latin America as well. And in addition to being a scholar and a professor, I've also been involved, as you alluded to, Andrew, with this initiative called Project Reconciliation, which is a collective of Indigenous peoples from Western Canada who have put in a bid to the government of Canada, who is the current owner of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, to acquire a majority ownership of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and its expansion, its proposed expansion. To transport oil from Alberta to the west coast of British Columbia for export to Asia. But by way of introduction, I think rather than talking about my academic lessons that I learned, possibly I could start off by talking about what I learned, sort of the road of hard knocks of being asked a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, to represent the Thunderchild First Nation on the board of directors of an oil company, Prairie Thunder Resources, in which they had taken an equity, a shareholder stake. So they became, this First Nation, Thunderchild First Nation, became the shareholders of this small privately owned oil and gas company. And the company's majority shareholders were based in Dallas, Texas. It's Edge Natural Resources and the Thunderchild First Nation. And it's a somewhat longer story how they came about this. But the short version of it is there had been a spill on the major river that butts their traditional territories. And they had decided, rather than suing the company, that they would work together with the company in terms of finding a solution that would work for everybody. The long story, it's a somewhat longer story, but that's how they came to have an equity stake in this company. Initially, it was a 16% stake. It's been somewhat diluted now because there've been capital calls moving forward. But as the representative, and I was asked by the chief, Chief Delbert Wapas, who is then chief of the Thunderchild First Nation, to represent them. As I said, we have a seat at the table, at the board table, but we don't want to do this ourselves. We'd like to have someone who has experience. I've been on boards of directors. I have my Corporate Directors Institute qualification. And my first reaction, as I had dinner with the chief and another colleague who brought us together, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Mason, I said, well, this is crazy. Representing a First Nation on an oil company board, that's, you know, why would I going to do that? That's just beyond. And then I thought, well, you know, what I've been spending my time doing in my career, if anyone's going to do this, maybe I should do this, and I'll maybe learn something from this. And I've learned lots from this, lots of very interesting things, and also been some incredible experiences, like going up to Thunderchild First Nation for their annual powwows and for other meetings, and meeting the people on the nation. And it's been just, you know, mind-blowing in terms of an experience. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that I hadn't learned from any of my doing case studies, it was the notion of sovereignty. The chief, and he stepped down as chief, and there's a new chief called Chief James Snakeskin. We're always talking about the notion of sovereignty. And I thought, okay, so Canadian First Nations, they're called First Nations, but they're not countries like the United States of America or the Republic of Peru or Canada. So what are they? What do they mean by sovereignty? And when I spent time trying to understand this, and this came over quite a bit of time, the notion was being masters in their own territory, masters of their own destiny. And in Canada, particularly First Nations, are in a sense, wardens of the state. Their funding comes from Canada, from the country. And First Nations people have to go cap in hand to the federal government and ask for money for health services, for education. And what is, when resource companies come into that area, the opportunity for First Nations is to work towards this notion of sovereignty, of being masters in their own lands, once again, which they were traditionally before colonization. And what does sovereignty mean? Well, sovereignty means, to me, what I boil it down to is two things. And I welcome, obviously, Karen's perspectives on this. One of them is voice, having a say, having a real say at the decision-making table, not just, you know, sign off on this and here you get a little something, but having a real voice, having a say about environment, having a say about protection of culturally sacred sites, just having a say in general, being respected and being a legitimate voice at the decision-making table. And then the second piece is money. Again, an independent source of income that can provide the things that the nation needs, and that the nation can decide themselves what it should be invested in. Not for someone else to say, hey, we'll give you this or we'll give you that, but an independent source of income. And that was, to me, one of the biggest lessons was, what does sovereignty mean? When Indigenous leaders, and here I'm talking about Canadian Indigenous leaders, what does sovereignty actually mean? And it took me quite some time. I was quite frustrated by, you know, sovereignty, we want sovereignty, what does that mean? And to me, it's those two things. It's a real voice and it's a source of income, whether it's, you know, payments from the resource that is on the traditional lands, or as Karen is talking about, opportunities, economic opportunities to invest in. So maybe I should stop there, but there's a lot more there. But if I distill it all down, it's that notion that has stuck with me the most.
Thank you very much, Harrie, and maybe turning to Heather, could be interested to hear your response to Harrie's distillation of the issues down to those 2 points, you know, also to hear from your perspective at Teck Resources, how do you approach engagement with the First Nations, and how maybe has that engagement process evolved over time and to bring you to where you are today at Teck? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Andrew. And I would like to start by thanking Remi for the invitation to participate today. It's a real pleasure to be part of this group, and you know, in particular, the opportunity to hear from Karen, who of course I have heard of before, and it's a real pleasure to be hearing more about her experience, and also from Harrie and Fiorella. We were able to spend some time together doing some prep for today's session, and very interesting to hear their perspectives, and looking forward to hearing more today. So maybe I will just say a little bit more in terms of my background. So I've been with Teck for about 8 years now. My primary focus in this corporate role is around the policies, systems, etc., to support Teck's work with Indigenous communities everywhere that we operate. So Teck has operations primarily in North and South America, but of course we also have exploration activities around the world. So very interesting work, certainly from my perspective there. Prior to working at Teck, I was a Canadian public servant, essentially had a full career with the Canadian federal government, where I was essentially dedicated to the negotiation of a range of different types of agreements with Canadian Indigenous communities right across the country, including modern day treaties, out-of-court settlements for historic grievances, and sort of most recently, before I left the federal public service, social program agreements, including a tripartite education agreement that was the framework for a national rollout in Canada. Some really interesting and exciting work that, you know, you talk about education is a pretty motherhood issue in terms of having an impact on quality of life for Indigenous communities. and maybe I will just quickly mention, I'm seeing it's coming up as a question in the chat, and we're hearing references to it in the remarks already. Certainly one of my current critical priorities is working with the local Indigenous communities around a number of our North American operations where we're looking to permit expansion activities and really digging into what securing free, prior, and informed consent means in those contexts. You know, in British Columbia, we have new legislation to implement UNDRIP. The federal government in Canada is working towards implementation of legislation nationally. So it's a very interesting and exciting and rapidly evolving context for our work with Indigenous communities, and certainly speaks very much to the issues, Harrie, you were raising around sovereignty and how that's playing out in real time in terms of decision making and input to public government processes. So I thought what I would do is focus in on a particular area of the work that is a priority for Teck, and that's really the agreement making process. So this is a critical foundational piece for Teck. We think that the process of negotiating agreements is really useful and important, and then having those legal commitments in place really establishes the foundation for how we're going to work together going forward. So, I sort of, I'm a bit cheeky sometimes when I say that when Indigenous communities approach Teck with questions or concerns about the potential impacts of our activities, our response is we just say yes. We want to meet, and it's very likely that we would be open to negotiating some type of an agreement in order to formalize that relationship. We think that process, and whether you call it an engagement process or a negotiation process, we think that that's really helpful in terms of just establishing a forum for those conversations and also communicating our openness to hearing what the Indigenous communities have to say. We do have an Indigenous people's policy at Teck. It's available on our website, where we make a very formal commitment to early engagement and providing resources to Indigenous communities, so to support kind of leveling the playing field and to support effective information sharing with us. So as part of that early engagement or early negotiation phase, we get to know each other. We get to we really want to understand what are the issues of concern, what are the worries, what are the priorities of the Indigenous communities in the areas where we're operating. And then that really informs the negotiation process, the real details there, and the scope of the agreement that will support our relationship going forward. And, of course, we negotiate large expected style of impact benefit agreements. We've got many of those types of agreements with those Indigenous communities in the immediate area where we operate. But we also negotiate a whole range of other agreements, whether it's early stage exploration agreements where, certainly our sense is that our impacts are going to be quite minimal at that point. We're walking on the land. We want a relationship. We don't want to walk on the land without the support and agreement of the local Indigenous communities. But at that point, we're not talking about, building a large mine. But we still think an agreement at that point is helpful. And of course, we negotiate agreements right through the whole process. Yes, Remi.
No, I think it's quite interesting what you're talking about, which is the difference in terms of the value, the life cycle of the project, where you're looking at early exploration, or then ongoing agreements that have been struck with between Indigenous communities or First Nations and the corporate actor. And that's where it was so fundamental to listen to Karen about the idea that a commitment has to be implemented and monitored, and to be able to continue building trust, because this is what we're really talking about when we talk about negotiations governance or relation with indigenous communities. And there's a question already on the chat on consent that we will actually bring to approach, probably I'll ask Karen and Harrie about it. But I want also to reach out to Fiorella to give maybe a larger context in terms of geographies. I mean, Harrie already started talking a little bit about Ecuador. Fiorella and myself, we actually were in Ecuador talking with Pachacutic and indigenous communities members in Zamora Chinchipe at the end of October. She's more a specialist of Peru, Chile, and Argentina. But I think the question here is trying to see what are the stages in terms of interactions with communities in Latin America, in Africa, or in other regions. What are the lessons learned from Canada that can also be used for other geographies? And I think a specific issue which is interesting, we're talking already about the idea of building agreements, partnership, and so on. But in many jurisdictions, there's still the question of being able to efficiently survey the communities, understanding their rights, understanding what is the exposure for the investor, what is the exposure for the company also, and be able from the get-go to create a relationship. We see that in Apurímac in Peru. We see that with issues across obviously Australia, Papua New Guinea, the issue with indigenous rights and First Nations there also. So there's a series of different case studies that we actually have it on our database. But Fiorella, maybe can you just also bring to our attention from the perspective of the government, also you were working at the Ministry of Mining before, what is the perception of the role of companies, First Nations, and academic actors into trying to be able to survey this? Sorry if I was a little broad, just to turn and bridge to Fiorella. Thank you.
No worries. Well, hello, thank you. First of all, thank you to Embellie and Emerging Market Investors Alliance for the invitation. It's a pleasure to me to share this discussion with very talented people. First of all, I would like to talk a little bit about my background. My last experience was in the Peruvian Ministry of Energy and Mining. I was the advisor of the Deputy Minister of Mines, and my job was basically to implement strategies to negotiate with the communities and indigenous communities the agreements for the availability of projects. Well, right now I'm the country manager at Embellie, so I work a lot with the prior consultation process and exploration and mining projects. Recently, well, the Peruvian Ministry of Energy and Mining hired us to develop guides for identification and affectations to collective rights of indigenous people and mining activities. What I hear about everybody's talking right now, it's really good practices that other countries are implementing in well, with most knowledgeable and with more experience. The thing is, in Peru, the prior consultation and to work with indigenous or native people was incorporated in the legislation like some years ago, maybe 10 years ago. The thing is, we also signed a convention for the 1669, but the thing is, the government didn't implement the legislation. So what is happening right now, like the companies are a little bit afraid of this prior consultation. And what it was very interesting was Karen saying is all what you have to implement to talk with indigenous people. It's like they don't have to be scared about it. They have to work in employment. They have to work in negotiation agreements. So they don't have to just let all the government do everything, you know. So I think it's interesting all the practices that other countries has already implemented with the indigenous communities. So they have made more work about it, and you know, all the prior consultation and working with indigenous communities. It's not like I would say it's new for us, but we're still learning about it. The companies are sometimes really afraid to deal with the communities. I always say you don't have to be afraid to talk with them. You can. It's better if you are more close to them. It's better if you settle agreements. I mean, the government can make their job. It's okay because they are part of this pre-representation, but also the companies have to implement more good practices.
No, I think that that's very valuable, and maybe just to transition and turn to maybe the second topic that we wanted to run onto, which is the kind of innovation in agreement structure and ownership structure, and we see that the wide range of obviously issues depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the level of relation between indigenous communities and companies that are very different. You're looking at Latin America, Canada, and others, but Canada is probably a country where you have those base case practices in ownership structure. I will turn first to Harrie and maybe then to Karen on this. I mean, Harrie, we've talked about those issues since I was a young PhD student, so I know you've been looking on different cases here on issues of sovereignty and sovereign wealth funds, trust funds that could be together on the structure to be make sure that the social performance of projects is actually in the best interests of the communities. Can you maybe just take it over from there and try to suggest areas where the experience that you had in Alberta, for example, could be very valuable for our attendants, which I mentioned again are a lot from Latin America, from Africa, and East Asia.
Sure. And what I'd like to talk about is this initiative or collective called Project Reconciliation. But before I describe what the concept is, I want to go back to a comment that Karen made, that she cautioned companies to not go into communities and say, here's our plan, and can you please sign here? That admonition to companies applies to Indigenous leaders as well. I say that as a preface to what I'm about to say here, because this notion of Project Reconciliation came out of what I mentioned in my previous remarks, working with then Chief Delbert Wapas of the Thunderchild First Nation. So the background here is Trans Mountain Pipeline is a pipeline that is an oil pipeline that runs from Alberta to the British Columbia coast near Vancouver, where it goes onto ships and it ships the oil to Asia, where the demand is, the biggest demand is for oil. And for some time now, there's been a need for increased pipeline capacity to get oil to export markets. And Trans Mountain was owned initially by Kinder Morgan out of Texas, and they wanted to expand the pipeline in order to increase the capacity to get oil to those Asian markets. Kinder Morgan got frustrated with the whole process of working with not only with Indigenous communities, but also environmental activists who also often work together with Indigenous communities or help fund Indigenous communities to oppose infrastructure development. And so there's that was frustrating Kinder Morgan, and Kinder Morgan finally said, okay, we're done, we're finished, we're gonna not do this thing. The government of Canada said, wait, hold on a minute, we can't do that. This is important to Canada. The energy industry, particularly the oil and gas industry, is very important to Canada. Canada's one of the largest, has the largest reserves in oil and gas, is one of the largest exporters of oil and gas to the world, and provides obviously royalties and tax income to the country. So the government of Canada bought the pipeline from Kinder Morgan of Texas. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline and its plans for expansion is owned by the government of Canada. And when this happened a couple of years ago, I sat down with the two gentlemen that I already mentioned, the former chief of Thunderchild First Nation, the gentleman Steve Mason, who's an entrepreneur business guy in Calgary, and a couple of other Indigenous leaders, mostly former chiefs of First Nations, and said, the initiative that we did with an Indigenous community purchasing an equity stake in an oil company, couldn't we just do that same model and do it much larger? And couldn't Indigenous communities actually own a significant stake? There'd been some precedents of Indigenous communities owning 10% or 5% equity in some infrastructure initiative. But what about actually owning a 51% stake of this pipeline and having a real say, having a seat at the table, to have a real say, to have a voice, and to actually have income? Is this possible? And the Indigenous leadership said, well, that is something that is of interest to us. We would like to have that. We'd like to have that voice. We'd like to have this notion of sovereignty. Is it workable? So then working with the business guys, the financial whizzes, formed out an initiative whereby it is possible to actually, for the Indigenous communities, to purchase the 51% stake from the government of Canada and finance it, because this is an infrastructure project that has long-term contracts by oil shippers, 20-year contracts that are in place. So it's a very solid investment, and was able to raise the debt through a syndicated bond issue, which is a non-recourse syndicated bond issue, meaning that nobody could go with the Indigenous communities owning the pipeline. If something went wrong and things didn't turn out, the only thing that would be at stake is the asset itself. That's the only thing that the debt holders could go after, is repossess the asset, the pipeline. So that's the non-recourse bit, and a syndicated bond through one of Canada's largest banks. So that was in place. And then, of course, what would be needed was, because this is a collective, needed agreement from the various Indigenous communities. So the vision was of the Indigenous leadership was that this should be owned, if we were to go for this, and again, it's Indigenous leadership working with professionals, finance professionals, myself as a business school professor, others who had expertise, legal, all this. The idea would be that this would be owned by the Indigenous communities, and Indigenous communities would have to have a governance structure where their voice would be actually translated into corporate board structures, and as well as structures to deal with the money that would come from the pipeline. And so then we talked about, it isn't just getting the income from the pipeline, because it would be some sort of a windfall. What, again, this notion of sovereignty means that what we really want is long-term income that would sustain communities well into the future, the multiple generations, the notion of 7 generations of Indigenous concept of looking forward that far. And keeping in mind that oil may not last 100 years or 200 years. It may only have 30, 40 years of a run line. So that's who came up with this notion of taking a portion of the money, investing it into what we refer to as a low carbon Indigenous sovereign wealth fund. So part of the money would go to the communities immediately, but somewhere around 80%, and again, I hesitate to say exactly how much because I'm mindful of what Karen was saying, because we learned very much. We go into the communities and we talk, here's the broad concept. How could this work for you? But there's becoming general buy-in to this notion that we invest a large amount of it into a sovereign wealth fund, which is like the sovereign wealth funds that were set up initially in the 1950s and 1960s in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, where you spent time, Remi, with the idea of an income for the future. And this would be invested in low carbon initiatives, which is the future economy. So the concept behind it is that it isn't that Indigenous communities are given anything. They would commercially purchase this asset, and through that, and through investing it in the Indigenous Sovereign Wealth Fund in low carbon assets, they would be, communities would be transforming the natural wealth, the oil and gas wealth beneath the traditional territories, transforming it into financial wealth in the future low carbon economy to provide income into the future over the generations. And in the process, through the governance structure that Project Reconciliation has put together, have a voice in the building of the pipeline, the environmental protection, again, that Karen talks about. Again, if you're a majority owner, you can decide, we want to put in more protection. We don't want to have a risk of this or that. And we want to maybe change the routing somewhat because there are traditional sacred areas here that we don't want to impact. so you can make those decisions. But of course, not everybody can be on the board of the company, so it was a more complex structure that was erected. Anyway,
thank you. Thanks very much, Harrie. That's a very interesting sort of case study you've given there, and a structure that could make a lot of sense. And I'd be curious to hear Karen's thought on how that could make sense from her perspective for Indigenous groups. But also, Karen, there's been a question here coming through in the chat that'd be just curious for you to address from Miles about how do you define consent? What is your understanding of the meaning of that word? Because one of the issues that you can have is there are different definitions that float around. We have the United Nations Declaration. You have the concept of FPIC, which is out there, and others. And to you, does that create issues behind the sort of variation of how that can be defined by different players? Yeah, sort of how do you approach that particular very important word of consent?
First, I guess I'll answer the question and go into that whole notion of equity ownership. I think that that whole notion of consent, just sort of reading through some of the Chilcotin case, that is where the whole notion of consent comes from. From what I understand, it goes back to the rights and title holders of the land. And so, you know, this is a whole broader topic. I think it's a webinar of its own, is that whole issue with the Wet'suwet'en people. We have the rights holders, and then we have the legal band councils. I guess to try to put it in a nutshell is that both systems, like the legal jurisdiction government or the Indian Act chiefs and the rights and title holders, need to have a conversation to see how this will roll out, and providing consent, because we're talking about the people and the land. And from my perspective, it needs to work hand in hand. It can't be just one set of people, because the clan members are the same people that those leaders must, address and answer their questions. So I think that whole notion of consent, it can be a legal one, and it's a whole webinar of its own. And the Chilcotin case set some precedents for that. So going into the whole equity piece, just a bit of a precursor, because my background is in social work, I've spent quite a number of my years working in, front lines, different aspects of social work. And so I've had to really do a whole learning curve in relation to natural resources and economic development, what that means to Indigenous people, most specifically our communities. I read the book Triple Crown by the late Jim Prentice, who's the former Premier of Alberta, and who also worked for NRCan. And it's a very good read. It kind of gives you some historical context as what led us up to today. And in that book, he does reference equity ownership, which I think is a way to go. The notes I've made are, equity ownership. We need to have a long-term and sustainable avenue to own part of the infrastructure. That is the way to go. If we are going to, I use this as note, if we're going to hit the poverty nail on its head, this is the growing trend and part and parcel that must be offered. We're experiencing that right now with the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And the other piece that we're experiencing is that we need to take it a step further and assist the Indigenous nations of methods and means for meaningful equity. So that means finding that equity to put into the pipeline. That's where we need to be. We need to find ways to help us to make it work. To set up a system for us to fail will not help us. But to prosper, there's a win-win-win for everyone. The ultimate goal for Indigenous people is to reach full reconciliation according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And how we do that is through economic reconciliation. We want to administer prosperity. We want clean drinking water for all Indigenous people across Canada. We want to close those socioeconomic gaps for Indigenous people. We want to live a better quality of life and be up to the standards of the rest of Canadians. We want to achieve these through major projects. And I think the whole notion of equity ownership must be on the table as part and parcel of the deal, because alluding to what Harrie had said, that whole notion of sovereignty, we want to be able to stand on our own 2 feet and not look at, Government of Canada as handouts for our programs and services, and trying with what meager funds we get to address those socioeconomic issues. So I think to be able to stand on our own 2 feet is meaningful for us, so that we're able to make those decisions and, look at all of the areas of the inequities that our communities face. So I think that's really critical to any project, any major project going in Canada. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. It's a very strong endorsement. That's great to hear that perspective. Remi?
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought it was indeed quite interesting to get this perspective. Moving on the issue of overall consent, I mentioned on the chat, a specific webinar that we did on this. I've seen a few reactions, talking about, EMIA and a series of structure and capacity to work on this. We have actually a webinar that we're building on EMIA probably around May. Same thing on land issues, which is a big topic linked to First Nations and Indigenous relations with Indigenous communities, especially in Ghana, in South Africa. So those are all the topics that have been raised here. I'm thinking about putting specific webinar on this. So please stay tuned and we'll revisit this. Maybe turning to specifically to Heather, because I've seen Heather nod actively when Karen was talking about the perception and definition of consent and being able to build consent. That'd be quite interesting to get your perspective, and then I'll turn to Fiorella to get maybe a larger perspective on community relations and the steps that different actors should be following up to be able to build social license to operate on their projects and value creation for all sides. So maybe Heather first, and then I'll turn to Fiorella. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Remi. Yes, and I was nodding because what Karen is saying is really sharing important aspects of that the Indigenous perspective on consent, which is so good for us working on the industry side to hear. And I think that Karen, in her opening remarks, really set one of the themes for our discussions today around it sounds a bit trite to frame it this way, but that there is no cookie cutter approach. And I think that applies to the FPIC discussion as well, that it's a very new conversation for industry to be having. And I know Fiorella talked about how companies are afraid, this is uncertain for us, and we like certainty, right? Markets like certainty. But I think that this is a critical issue, that it's not going to be effective to look to government to provide, like a checklist of activities you have to do that is going to result in FPIC at the end, or, the establishment of some clearly articulated, steps in a process. To me, it's another example of where, we need open dialogue. Industry needs to be able to sit down with Indigenous communities and understand their governance structures, their decision-making processes. What does an FPIC process look like for an individual Indigenous community? Karen spoke about the different connections between the rights holders and the Indian band established by the Indian Act in Canada. We need to be mindful of all of these issues, and we can't be relying on government to tell us how to do that. That it really is going to be the result of that open dialogue with Indigenous communities, so that we can find a path forward together to get to a place where an Indigenous community has the information they need from the company, and we've participated in a process together that has them be in that place where they can make a determination around providing or not providing their free, prior, and informed consent for a particular project. And maybe I'll leave it there. I'm well aware that this hour is flying by.
Yeah, it's going back. I know it was wonderful if I share with the attendants that we had a series of calls to prepare for this webinar that were already extremely, wealthy in information and in exchange, and we probably will continue rapidly afterwards. But we're happy to continue the conversation and ask any question. There was a series of questions for Harrie, by the way, and others in the chat that might be interesting. But first, maybe on Fiorella, I think that was, what Heather mentioned is very relevant. We have different actors involved in this question. A lot of them have obviously different perspectives in different languages. Do not know easily how to interact, or are coming from different worlds or different visions. How is it possible to help, set up those negotiation table? How is it possible then to continue and survey on the fact that those agreements are implemented? And more specifically, I know you wrote a guide specifically for the Ministry of Mines in Peru on a relationship with communities and indigenous communities. What would be here the different steps, as we're mentioning, of to be able to build this trust and later sustainable value for the territory? You're on mute, yes.
Well, yeah, but I think it's important to difference two things. Like, one is the obligation to consult of the government, like the state has the responsibility whenever the indigenous or native people are directly affected. And the other thing is the companies, and they have to work with indigenous communities. I always talk with them and I say it's very different to talk with an indigenous community than another community, because indigenous community have their collective rights. So we have to deal with it, and the companies have to know how to work with the indigenous communities. So, and the other thing about the work or the job of the state or the government is, well, the 7 minimum stages of the process according to the principles interculturally. So there are two things. I understand when companies say, well, the government should tell us what to do or how to deal with them. But I think it's important companies work with the indigenous communities first, and they don't have to be, again, they don't have to be afraid to talk with them, to settle agreements. It's all part, if the projects of mining, they start in the land of the indigenous communities. I think it's important to implement more best practices and environment with high standards also.
Yeah, thank you, Fiorella. And I realize we're arriving to the last 10 minutes, but obviously we can always, go a little bit, beyond this time. And maybe just, turning to the different panelists, and Andrew first, maybe on what you're taking out of those conversations, and then, obviously steps forward into either sharing some of the best practices I was mentioning, or into improving the relationship between the different actors. It'd be great if we can all give like 2-3 minutes of us, maybe Andrew, then, Karen, Harrie, Heather, Fiorella, and myself. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this discussion was so well laid out by Karen initially, kind of giving a framework of what needs to happen to move the process forward. And I kind of feel like any investor can take that checklist and use that as a sort of a talking points when they're looking at companies who are involved in the extractive space. But also, this equity perspective that Harrie's offered, and it generated a number of follow-up questions, which I wish we had time probably to address, about things like government guarantees, potentially a whole different regulatory process surrounding indigenous equity stakes in these projects. I think that's a very exciting new direction that this whole area, could take, and something also for investors to be very aware of. So it's great to hear all of that.
Thank you. And Karen, do you maybe want to chip in with some concluded words here?
Okay, just to sum up and sort of look at the whole discussion that we had and the points that were made, relationship building is critical and crucial. Procurement opportunities for Indigenous communities is also critical. Employment and training to build capacity within communities is important. The environment, again, this is another critical component, the highest environmental standards possible, all throughout the project, not just on day one, not written on paper. It must be practiced on the ground. And especially in relation to what Harrie had mentioned, that any cultural sites, sacred sites, they have to be protected. And the last piece is on equity. We must find ways forward for Indigenous people to close those inequity gaps on the socioeconomic front. And that is one of the ways we do it. And that whole notion that the question of consent, that also needs to be brought into this as well. So thank you for having me on this panel. I really enjoyed it. Misai.
Darren, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm bridging to maybe Harrie and trying to tie things up together and issues that we might want to continue revisiting in the future and in future events. Please chip in.
Okay, first of all, Karen made a comment about we'd like to manage prosperity. One of the things that I've heard time and again from Indigenous leaders is we're tired of managing poverty and we'd like to manage prosperity. And that has really rung true to me, and that's part of what we're involved in here. The other thing that in terms of one thing to add here, this process of engaging is very difficult and very time consuming. And even though I spent a good part of my career studying and doing case studies in various different places, it has still surprised me. We've been with Project Reconciliation at this for 2.5 years on a daily, weekly basis. And part of that is the engagement and part of it is we're in ongoing discussions. We actually have a bid into the Government of Canada, and I've been personally involved with weekly conversations with the Department of Finance, who are the owners of the Trans Mountain Pipeline right now. But more importantly is the conversations with communities, the First Nations, the Indigenous communities. And that has been very interesting. What we've more recently done is kind of shifted the communication. Rather than the formal engagement, we're coming to the community, we're meeting with chief and council. We have some wonderful people in our team, and I'm specifically thinking of two women on our team. One is a young woman in her mid-20s, Lyanna Wolfleg, who's an Indigenous woman from the Siksika First Nation, and Jen Turner, who's based on the coast. And they're working together and reaching out to communities, not through formal channels, but through the informal channels. And they like to talk about sort of the women's channels and through the grandmothers, and so-and-so knows so-and-so. And one of the things that I've really learned is how connected the Indigenous world is. People do live in individual Indigenous communities or First Nations, but they have family members in other communities. And much of what I've learned is the communication that goes on through many of these informal channels. And so it's a slow process, but our engaging with the different communities that are of interest to this initiative, setting up a low carbon Indigenous Sovereign Wealth Fund with financing with income from the pipeline, is through that informal process, which defies any sort of notion of what a government might look like or a corporate process might look like. But we're finding that is actually an effective way of communicating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned, the key issue of communication, of informal communication, steady communication, building trust. I mean, we've worked on this several times. And maybe turning to Heather for the concluding word. There's also a series of questions on economic inclusion. I know that's a focus of yours and of a series of experts on this panel. Maybe do you want to explain a little bit on tying down this communication, economic inclusion? How does Teck, work on this very briefly, and what are your concluding words on this panel?
Right. Thank you, Remi. And I know time is tight, so I will keep my comments quite brief. But first of all, to just really re-emphasize one of the things that we've heard from all the speakers today, but particularly Karen, about the importance of relationship, that this isn't a transactional type of activity we're engaged in, that relationships are really critical to success. And I would also emphasize the message around the role that industry can play in economic reconciliation and supporting that shift from managing poverty to managing prosperity. To me, that's a critical opportunity for the extractives industry, is to really work with Indigenous communities to support that, the achievement of that goal. You know, and I think speaking about the experience that I've had through negotiations at Teck, we've had many discussions with Indigenous communities about the equity issue. And we have not yet negotiated an agreement that is sort of truly representative of those equity interests. I suspect it's largely due to the riskiness associated and the cyclical aspect of mining, that it doesn't present the same opportunities as an infrastructure project. But I would put that out as a challenge, that, you know, this is something we need to be putting our minds together to solve, is how can we continue to find ways for Indigenous communities and mining companies to share those benefits of mining in a way that's really going to meet the needs of Indigenous communities. And I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thank you very much. Again, plenty of very good notions on which we can actually build on in future conversation. Maybe Fiorella, your last word on this, and taking into account the perspective of different countries, the needs from companies, or the needs for training also from communities. You know, what could be, you know, when you have companies that try to engage with communities, when you have communities that need to have the resources to be able to have a fruitful negotiation and pull up the implementation on those of the negotiation. What would be your takeaway on this and your suggestions to different actors?
Very shortly, well, the engagement process with Indigenous communities is very important, and also the conversation with them. The government will do its job, but also the company should work in the relationship with the Indigenous communities to provide better benefits and also prosperity. Supporting communities is very important. As I said, it's different to just deal or to negotiate with the communities that live around projects than the Indigenous communities. It's a very different way. We have to respect their collective rights, and the company should know how to work with them.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And just to answer a question that was on the chat, there is obviously a recording of this webinar. Give me a little time to put it together, and we'll actually upload it on our website. We also will have a transcript. So same thing. I mean, feel free to send me a message. Same. I mean, you know how to reach me on LinkedIn, for example. That's usually a very good way to do so. So we will provide this. We do a lot of work on cross-sectional collaboration, as I said, with the Devonshire Initiative, a series of workshops and classes also. So those are available also. So just reach out to us if you need some more information. And I'd like to use maybe the last few seconds again to thank our panelists. I'm very, very fortunate to be able to invite to my living room once a month, even actually more regularly, my friends in the industry around the topic of common interest. So thank you again, you know, Heather, Karen, Fiorella, and the guys, Harrie, Andrew, for joining this morning. And we'll follow up on the questions that were provided. So thank you again, and have a lovely day and a lovely weekend soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye.